The University of Workers' Correspondence. Good evening, dear comrades. Today is a scheduled lesson for the University of Working Correspondence. Topic of the lesson is the modern stage of Leninism. The lecture is given by Doctor of Philosophy, Professor Alexander Sergeyevich Kazyonnov. Please, yes. It sounds a bit unusual, I guess. In the summer in August, we had a conference in Sablino, and I have prepared a report, an article, and presented a seemingly simple topic. Why Leninism? It has long seemed to me that it is precisely necessary to talk about the fact that in the modern ideological struggle, in the modern mass of public organizations that exist, including those like those who stand for the so-called New Socialism, there's this mashup in this and all sorts of misunderstandings. So it would be better to define Leninism as a core, central, main line of social and communist development. So I spoke out, wrote an article and several theses about why Leninism is now the core and the meaning that true Marxists, true communists adhere to. And I wrote a more detailed article, sent it to a collection here that is published based on the materials of this conference, but then this topic somehow didn't leave me, stayed with me, and I kept wondering what's going on, and finally figured it out. I have understood it. Yes, by the way, I gave a lecture here. It was close to the topic, and after the lecture I understood what was going on. The fact is that, more or less objectively, a new modern period of Leninism has formed. And this understanding that a new period of Leninism had arisen allowed us to shed some light on the past and to understand the current situation. Well, and in order to understand what the new stage of Leninism is, you need to know what Leninism is in general. And I think that all the comrades who are present here know what Leninism is. For example, let's ask Comrade Chikov here, what is Leninism? Well, Marxism-leninism is a teaching... No, not Marxism, Leninism. I said. Yes, Leninism is Marxism of the era of revolutions and counter-revolutions. Yes, good. By the book, Marxism-leninism. Yes, there's a theory of this stage. Any other thoughts on this topic? What is Leninism? Well, they write a lot now about it, right? Yes, yes, sure. They write a lot about this. Well, in a nutshell, as they say briefly, happiness for everyone and for free. To put it simply. Okay, thank you. Everything is clear to me here. And this is such a not a crude but Philistine understanding. The people who don't understand this, they have these imprints in their mind that it's some kind of something good, some good society, yes. But in this audience we always talk about fresh, new, deep, fundamental, theoretical problems. And this problem, Leninism, especially its new stage, is a fundamentally new problem. Moreover, when I have understood at the very last moment, corrected this article and put in the title that we're talking about the modern stage of Marxism, the foundation of the modern stage of Leninism. At that last moment, before the new year, I inserted this title and edited the article a little bit. And since I have been thinking about this topic all the time, that is, this topic pushes us all to all sorts of further reflections, including the fact that Leninism, modern Leninism, is first of all spiritual continuity, spiritual heritage, spiritual first of all, consciously, yes, consciously, spiritually in both sense, in broad sense and in the theoretical sense, narrowly theoretical sense, including what the spirit is, how is it transmitted, how is it inherited. Vladimir Ilyich had an article in his youth about what kind of inheritance do we refuse, and then he examines the revolutionary continuity, heritage of generations. In his work on the memory of Herzen, he considers this. But as far as purely spiritual devotion is concerned, what does spiritual devotion mean? And what is spirit in general at all? What is spirit? And I decided to look and to study, including our classics. I read some Vladimir Ilyich and I realized that spirit is not the subject of research, was not the subject of research. So the main theme associated with the spirit is that matter is primary, spirit is secondary. That's it. And let's say we open Lenin's main philosophical book on materialism, empirical criticism, and there Lenin several times cites Engels' statements and his own statement and proves that matter is primary and spirit is secondary. And then we got no problems with this. This is widely accepted in society, there's no doubt about it. Let's say people do not come out openly with an idealistic understanding of history, but in any case I haven't met any. In fact, they have an idealistic understanding of reality, but they do not openly defend the idealistic understanding of history. There's no such thing, because this issue has been resolved and resolved quite firmly. But somehow next question arises, namely, the spirit is secondary. But it is not even tertiary, not fourth, not fifth, but secondary. This is important. It's secondary. It is determined by matter and social being, right? But it is still something fundamentally important and deep. Moreover, Engels also speaks about this in Ludwig Feuerbach. I will quote this literally. Matter is not a project of spirit, but spirit is the highest product of matter. Spirit is the highest product of matter. So, dear comrades, we need to focus on this highest product. It is exactly what we should focus on. But here, the question of the concept immediately arises. So what is spirit? What will we actually be dealing with? And I'm again that I knew this, of course, but for the purity of the experiment, I again looked through Lenin's works, Stalin's works, all the textbooks on philosophy. I myself taught philosophy all my life, and so somehow they did not deal with the spirit, but they did not deal with the spirit in the proper sense of the word. But of course they dealt with the products of the spirit. Yes, and we know, understand outstanding examples of the outstanding spirit. Let us say the work of Aristotle, but it is the highest form of the spirit of antiquity, and it retains its full meaning now, today. Here is Aristotle in full, my reference book. In particular, I recently reached the category of sovereignty, and I have been developing it for 2 years, but I still can't finish the book, because I keep running into some new problems. And I realized that Aristotle fully understood what sovereignty was, but he expressed it in other terms and categories. So when people read it, they don't understand what it's about, that it's about sovereignty. Plato is also one of my go-to literature. So I have already spoken here several times that in addition to forms of government, there are types of government, kinds of government. This is what I have learned for myself, and so I taught it several times. And now that I have arranged this, I read it in Plato too. It's just that when I studied Plato before, he split it into two different books. Moreover, the first two forms of government are discussed in the third book, and the others in the eighth book of his work on the state. The first two are about aristocracy and monarchy. These are the ones that he considers to be the best, the good, the well-organized states. Then he moves on to other topics in several books, and then he returns again to the structure of the state. And the bad ones are democracy, which means oligarchy. There's some kind of, and there's the worst of them is democracy. And let's say from the point of view of my present view, it is immediately clear to me that he's talking about only two types. He talks about the first kind, the first part, monarchy and aristocracy. These are different forms of one type of state. Which one? Of aristocratic one. Moreover, this is correct for an ancient state, the ancient state, for a time when the aristocracy only was born. And indeed, it was an aristocracy, and the state was an aristocracy, the power, that is, of these higher circles connected with the highest clan families. Then the aristocracy degenerated into various kinds of oligarchies. But the name was shortened, and today some of our comrades are talking there about European landed aristocracy. There has been no landed aristocracy for a long time now. The aristocracy was there, over there, and nowadays there are various kinds of oligarchies, including land oligarchies, of course. Yes, so Plato also has two types of state, good ones which belong to the aristocracy and bad ones which are perversions of the state and generally worthless, and the inhabitants is only upset by it. So the topic of Leninism, this topic of Leninism also caused me this, because the need to turn to what the spirit is, and what is the continuity of the spirit is. For us, this is actually a real problem. So they say the party was banned. Nobody banned it. It disbanded. Disbanded. And only a small fragment fell out of the Soviet Communist Party that has preserved the continuity. We all know this fragment, this little piece. This is the Russian Communist Workers' Party. And there, you remember, there were many different groups, communist parties. They emerged later, not to mention the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks, which was more or less noticeable, the Socialist Party of Workers, the Communist Party of the Workers, and some others there. And at some point, since I was involved in this practically and theoretically, I was responsible for this direction in our education. I had a card index. There were, finally, I got to about 70 parties and groups of this kind. And then I stopped doing it. There are very small, all sorts of tiny things and all sorts of junk, and a lot of time was spent on this library, but I stopped doing it. But the same situation was in 1917. Few people remember this. We only remember the parties that got through to this Congress of Soviets. There were the Mensheviks, Menshevik Internationalists, and others. There were 6 parties, but socialist parties, socialist types, were 20. In total, there were about 50 parties. 20 of them were socialist in nature, and only one that maintained continuity of Marxism. What was this continuity based on? Lenin and the Bolshevik Party kept revolutionary Marxism. preserved revolutionary Marxism. By the end of the 19th century, Marxism had been stolen away. Many different types of Marxism emerged, including social democracy. And I'm forced to look again at the social democracy, and you can see very interesting things. What the social democracy, what democracy has come to today. We can see in Germany the social democracy, Scholz. He's a social democrat. He's a representative of the Social Democratic Party. No, Christian democracy is a different thing. And this comes from the social democracy of that, not the ancient one, but the end of the 19th century. The Second International. You remember, this is the party of the Second International. Moreover, the name itself now causes me such doubts, and I don't know how to resolve them. Social democracy. Social here sounds ambiguous. These, as I understand it, are the Bolsheviks and others. That means such staunch revolutionists, they understood this as socialist democratic party, right? And someone understood social as social democratic. So social democratic and social democratic. That is public democratic. And the bourgeois part of it rolled along this line. This is a social democratic party. So the current president of democracy, Meyer, he also led the Social Democratic Party of our... And before that, the gas currents were provided to us by Schröder. By the Schröder guy. Social Democratic Party of Germany. And as fate would have it, something caught my attention. My eye. A note, a draft of Stalin's preparation of an article for the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution in the 27th, in the year 27. And Stalin writes there that the spirit of Marxism has left social democracy, just as social democracy has left Marxism. And following this, it will also abandon the banner of Marxism, stop carrying the banner. And now, when we know the history of German social democracy and before the war, when they together with the communists, created bloc against the ruling class, and both of them, they were actually exterminated. And the Social Democrats got 2.5 million people who died in Germany. And it's quite in God's grace. Somehow no one talks about this regarding concentration camps against communists in Germany. There were 2.5 million of us there. And they're saying that Stalin destroyed millions. It's a lie, yes. It all turned out to be a lie that Stalin killed that many. Even Khrushchev admitted that. Repressed people were less than a million. That's also wrong. Less than a million, you mean those who were shot? No, repressed. No, actually, officially, there are more repressed. You read the wrong thing. Wrong books. Not so. So, this is where social democracy in Germany has degenerated to. Stalin predicted this in 1927. So, that is, yeah, but I want to draw your attention first to the fact that, as Stalin put it, the spirit of Marxism has left the social democracy. The question is, what is the spirit of Marxism? What is the spirit of Marxism? Can anyone answer what the spirit of Marxism is? I don't think you can, so I won't torture you on this topic, but if only this were just a phrase, there would be no problems, but this problem is supplemented namely by the fact that Vladimir Ilyich, in the same work, philosophical work, Materialism and Imperialism, writes, completely in the spirit of Marx, quite in the spirit of Marx, and in close collaboration with him, Engels in all his works, philosophical works, briefly and clearly contrasts the materialistic and idealistic lines on all issues. This is, of course, absolutely correct. But the spirit, and Lenin remembers the spirit. What about the spirit? It may seem that it's, so to speak, well, some kind of little word used for style, spirit of Marxism. But still, it's not just this topic for it to be just a word. Secondly, the question arises again, what does it mean, spirit of Marxism? Since this topic has not been studied previously, I won't ask you, but I will say myself that I have concluded and write that spirit of Marxism is all the works of Marx and Lenin that were written while they lived. Lenin writes somewhere there, Marxism is the work of Stalin, Marx and Engels. There are no unnecessary words there. Why? Because they were focused on the political movement, on the revolutionary movement. Therefore, everything they write is conditioned by practice. And here we come to another problem, which, as I thought, our literate comrades had long ago solved for themselves and left behind, but it turns out I was wrong. Therefore, I will again recall Marx's first thesis about Feuerbach. I'm sure everyone has read it, and everyone turned it on themselves. Used it. Let me remind you exactly so that there's no misunderstandings. The main shortcoming of all previous materialism, all the preceded materialism, including Feuerbach's materialism, on which they had just relied, these theses, they are from 1845. Marx was 27 years old. He was just a Feuerbachian, and Engels says we have all become Feuerbachians. But a little time passed, and Marx realized that Feuerbach has done a lot, but also went to a dead end. So the thing is that the subject's reality, sensuality, is taken only in the form of an object. I ask you to stop and think. What does he criticize Feuerbach for? For taking the subject in form of an object. Or in the form of contemplation. Contemplation, well, first of all, it's a feeling, a representation, a speech about a representation, about content, about seeing an object in person, in a representation, or in the form of content, and not as a human sensory activity. Practice is not subjective. This is what materialism and Feuerbach is criticized for, because they do not approach it subjectively, but one must approach it subjectively. What does it mean? And now I understand that some comrades do not understand what subjectively means, and what Marx demands from himself and others, but it is required to achieve that it is necessary to start not from a specific person, not from a thing, but from the state of both society and movement and the material sphere that you reflect in consciousness. And then he writes further, a person is not an abstraction inherent to a separate individual, but his essence, person, is a set of social relations. So it's not about the object that I contemplate, but about the social relations in which this object is in. is located. So, well, a nice adult guy, man, probably serious, intelligent, since he's sitting in this audience. So a newcomer will not say anything about him, anything more. He perceives him as an object, and we, Viktor Ivanovich, perceive him as a subject, of course. That this Viktor Ivanovich has always been in the party, a communist, always actively fought, always organized. It means this ideological and theoretical work. He's a good family man, means he earns a lot, well, and so on and so forth. So in the 17th year, when there were 20 different socialist parties, both in that time and today there are a lot of parties like this that call themselves socialists. So that's how CPSU disintegrated with various kinds of subjects. And only a small part of the CPSU remained. A small subject of the Russian Communist Workers' Party. Here it was the bridge between Leninism of the past and Leninism of the present. And this spiritual continuity was somehow not needed by us because we did not deal with it. But as soon as I carried away, of course, immediately stumbled upon this. Why? Because it was very obvious in our history. Because as soon as Gorbachevism arose, we immediately reacted to it, almost immediately. Well, for about 6 months, maybe a year, there were some illusions. We had some illusions here. Came to Leningrad as a young man and stayed in Gostiny Dvor, handsome man talking to workers there without a piece of paper. He was Gorbachev like that. But it soon became clear that this was mostly just talk, and the conversations in general are mostly irrelevant. Not to mention that a Russian person treats the Russian language somehow, I don't even know how to say it, not just uncultural, not just unpartisan, but uncultured, puts the stresses wrong in the words. Well, dear comrades, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin was a Georgian and from some backwoods. He had a good, pure Russian language. And here, Russian allows himself such things. This is not in the framework of party culture, right? This is uncultured. We immediately responded to this matter and actually immediately began to form this Society of Scientific Communism. A practical movement arose to preserve Leninism. And it was no coincidence that it was born in Leningrad. Why? Well, the fact that here already a theoretical reversal has begun, which continues the theory of Marxism-leninism in its main points, and above all, the theory of the labor value. Sorry, the theory of labor use value. Yes. Not just the theory of value, but the theory of labor use value. This is a very deep theoretical thought. And it was there right away. It wasn't, well, not right away, but you see, a long period of time passed. Yelmeyev, I don't remember which year it was from, Comrade Yelmeyev, about the 2013, yes, plus or minus, that generation began to... he was born in 1913, and that generation started to delve into these topics, developing this theory. And they published a book in 1988, Yelmeyev, The Reproduction of a Man of Society, Dolgov, Debt Management of Scientific and Technological Progress, Consumer Cost, The Basis of Consumer Costs. And in 1968, a book by Mikhail Vasilievich Popov, The Resolution of Contradictions of Socialism as the First Phase of Communism, where he published for the first time and explained us what are the printers, what do the imprints of capitalism mean? Imprints of capitalism in communism mean. well, we knew what that meant, and the management, of course, insisted on that imprints in people's consciousness and behavior existed. That's the only thing they acknowledged. Marx writes, on all spheres of the society's life, these imprints are imprints of capitalism, mutar malen. And to us from above, and it was meant that they are so clean and fluffy, they don't have any imprints of capitalism. But of course, all the lowly people down there, of course, all have the imprints of capitalism on their communist behavior. So these three things, right? No, I forgot about the third thing. Alexei Sergeyev has finally revived the understanding of what the Soviets are, the councils are. He also explained us that the Soviets are such government bodies that are built from enterprises, from plants, factories. It seems like we were also associate professors who taught us all this, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The Soviets is a form of dictatorship of the proletariat, but we have already forgotten it. We were no longer taught that, but from above, the academics and professors just taught us councils, Soviets, and that the fact that they were built by plants and factories, enterprises, has long been forgotten. And this is a fundamental thing. This is a fundamental basis of Leninism. That's how they were born. They were born during the first revolution in 1905. By the way, there will be a conference in Ivanovo in the fall. Will you go there? I don't know yet. No info. I think we should go. Where does this information come from? A girl from Ivanovo University sent me that where they were organizing a conference. And I say, of course, I will come and bring an article. And I wanted to call you too, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. But then I thought maybe I'll see you later. Anyways, so that's how things were. But why does this happen? Because, in fact, this new movement was already caused by the practice of anti-Stalinism, which was generated by Khrushchev. And by Khrushchevism. It has already split into parties, that is, in the 60s and 70s. And there were so-called Stalinists and so-called... There were no anti-Stalinists, of course. But, of course, it was clear that there were anti-Stalinists. But there was such stern, staunch anti-Stalinists, like the doctor of historical sciences and academic... What was his name? History of CPSU he wrote. His nephew is currently run away abroad. Ponomarev. He was a member of the Politburo, academic Ponomarev, editor of all the histories of the CPSU that were published from 56 to 57. He was a seasoned anti-Stalinist. And after the coup, when Yeltsin was sitting in the Kremlin, they kept a room for Ponomarev. He went to this room of his as if to work. It is not known what he was doing there. And even without his nephew, who works under the CIA, who worked for the CIA, I got the impression that he also himself also worked for the CIA. He was some kind of this dark person in this regard, at least. And it turns out that he was at the origin of all the main documents. The Commission of the Constitution of the 77th year of the party program, this guy, this revisionist Khrushchevite constitution was being prepared. He did that. He participated in was part of that commission. This guy who worked for CIA. And so on and so forth. So this new movement arose, and we were already clearly aware that after all some people there are Stalinists who respect Stalin, which means that they preserve the idea of the development of socialism in the year of Stalin, and there is another line which means that anti-Stalinist line, and in fact anti-socialist, and its subsequent life clearly showed this. The Stalinists, they supported, scientific socialism and Lenin's line and Stalin's line, and created the Russian Communist Workers' Party. Before that, there was a fairly broad, proactive movement of communists and the United Front of Workers. These are all forces that were based one way or another on the recognition that Stalin was an outstanding practical, theoretical figure, and of course without him there's no history, history of communism, no history of Russia, and no USSR history without him. And this spiritual path, which arose even under Brezhnev, took shape somewhere in the mid-80s, 1980s, when this last stage of the counter-revolution began. And here too, on one hand, it's strange that we supposedly literate people missed this back then and starting to deal with it. On the other hand, there's nothing surprising here yet. Goebbels said that, and I remember that in the preface to the philosophy of the law. Hegel said that in his preface to that the thought comes after reality has already completed its existence. That's what Hegel said. Then the mind turns out to be smart. Yes, and in hindsight we call it strong. And Lenin colorfully put it like this: the owl of Minerva, the owl of Minerva of wisdom, flies out at dusk when reality has already ended its existence. And then philosophy begins to paint its gray colors onto gray. But it's good that it's starting to smear. They say that philosophy or history teaches nothing. It does, really. Then it teaches us that a new modern stage of modern Marxism has begun. Modern Marxism-leninism, modern Leninism, which has gone through this crucible of denial within the CPSU. The elites rejected us. We fought it with them. We lost. But we fell out. We did not break. We preserved the spirit of Marxism and the spirit of Leninism and continue to go, to hold it. The spirit. So modern Leninism is scientific socialism and the practice of the struggle for socialism. And this is very important, that this practice exists. This movement that arose in Leningrad on the basis of our Society of Scientific Socialism and the United Front of Workers of the Russian Initiative movements of Communists of Russia, not just out of nowhere, but it's a reflection of life, a reflection of our struggle of social movement. Whoever stands for scientific socialism and this connection with revolutionary practice is Leninist. This is Leninism. Who does not stand for it is that's not Leninism, not Leninist, not Marxism-leninism, and therefore it's not Marxism. They're Marxists in words, but in practice it's just talk. And therefore, here is this German social democracy and its governmental position of today. It shows where this quote-unquote Marxism, socialism goes, that is based on democratic soul, which has rejected the spirit. That's where it leads to. They did not reject Marxism. They rejected the spirit of Marxism. And what is the spirit? And the spirit in scientific socialism and is in scientific socialism and the connection of scientific socialism with the practical revolutionary movement. That is the spirit of Marxism. Marxism is a revolutionary teaching. It sounds revolutionary. And it's a revolutionary teaching. And the fact that we have forgotten about the spirit is a big mistake and misunderstanding. Moreover, this very shortcoming was recognized by Engels. Even by Engels. Engels, starting in 1890, wrote several letters to his friends, correspondents, including Danielson, Russian correspondent, that we were still more concerned with the material side of the matter, the economic side of the matter, and did not pay enough attention to the construction that is constructed over the economical basis, superstructure, political, ideological superstructure. So but the truth is that Marx wrote in the 18th, for example, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And this is a brilliant analysis of how the superstructure affects economic and political processes. So there are 5 letters like this, and I recommend that you read them. And Joseph Vissarionovich apparently was familiar with them, Stalin, and also in his work on dialectical materialism, which was included in the short course of the party teaching. He returns to this issue and also talks about the spiritual life of society. He says that spiritual life in its turn influences economic and political processes, that superstructure does influence social economic processes. And Engels, in one of his letters, even specifically indicates what kind of influence it is and how it occurs. And he says, he writes, when the superstructure acts in accordance with the basis, corresponds with the economic movement of the development of society, society develops even faster. But the setting, the superstructure, can act against the progressive development of economy. Then the economy slows down. The economy slows down from the action of the superstructure. And finally, the government can still develop some of them and some of them not. Then society slows down, and you and I can clearly project onto our Russia. When Leninist country, when Leninist and Stalinist superstructure acted in accordance with progressive development, our economy, whoosh, was the first to break into space and did not lag behind in the atomic construction and information technology. And until the beginning of the 70s, we were going together at the same pace with America with this technology. Then special decrees from the party ruined this direction. Khrushchev's decrees, and Lebedev, the main theoretician, was sent to Kiev, away from power, and everything slowed down. It slowed down because of the idea of individual computers. They were afraid that we would have a personal computer even before they had one in the West, and we would copy all these anti-government, quote-unquote, things using these computers. And this revisionist government was right to be afraid. Why? Because it was pursuing an anti-people line, an anti-communist line. That is why they were afraid. This government, it was afraid. Here's how superstructure works. And this is what was not given enough attention to. It's the same with the spirit. They didn't even figure out the situation with the spirit. And so it remained in the general plan in relation to matter. In general, matter and spirit are opposites. And what is spirit, especially in its real form? They didn't say. And it exists, therefore, only in reality, only in an individual form. The spirit of Comrade Galko here, your spirit, my spirit. Yes, and it can be deposited in some material form, manifest in the form of capital, or manifest in form of a painting. This is a wonderful picture. There's another one. By the way, what kind of painting is this? Something to do with Lenin's and the workers. Anyways, in such things it manifests, deposits in material things, but as a living being, and Lenin is still alive, acts as it is, he's alive. So again, we ask this question, what is spirit? But leave us this question for now, and we will return once again to the first thesis about Feuerbach now, with my comment now. The main drawback of all previous materialism, including Feuerbach's, was that the subject, in translation in the book, in the third volume, it is published, of Marx and Engels, and I'm translating the subject in Latin is called object. So there's предмет, object, and there's subject. So there's a detail here. Nuance. In Latin it is an object sound, and in English it is. How do you call it in English? No, not object. You call предмет a subject. So a thing. It's a subject. 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 So it's one word, yes, but there's problems with this. It's not a simple word. And literal people need to understand this. The difference between object and subject. That means that Marx writes that the subject, that is the object, we understand reality, sensuality, is taken either in the form of contemplation, in the form of an object, or in the form of contemplation. Contemplation is thinking. So thinking in the sense of representation, not a concept, but representation in the human mind. In the form of judgment and not as human sensory activity. It is in no way subjective. Practice, that is, in practice, a mass of subjects act, say, in the revolution, in the 17th year, 20 communist, socialist-oriented parties acted. This means that in the 90s, 50 parties were born there, or 74. 50 probably had such a socialist background or subname. But out of these, only one subjectively corresponded to this process. This is a Russian Communist Working Party. That's where spirit was, along this line all the time. That is why it happened so that the active side, in contrast to materialism, developed through idealism. That is, he's hinting here at Hegel. And the big question is, of course, what Hegel means by subjectivity. But I recommend that you figure out this one out for yourself. It's quite a difficult question. Although perhaps, if there's a need, I can, of course, speak out on this matter. So, the question is, what is spirit? Spirit is the instinct of knowledge, of trying to understand. To some extent, it already exists in the animal world. And say, which one of you has ever observed animals? Yes, especially wild animals. They're always taking risks. Everything is necessary or not necessary. Again, necessary again, dangerous, not dangerous. Especially, let's say, such cowardly aliens. They're always on guard. Always spend the time distinguishing between what is necessary and what is not. What's dangerous and what's not. Whether it exists or things exist or not. This is an instinctive activity of the spiritual nature, but not a spirit is born in the animal world. And of course, a person is a creature for whom this instinct grows into a feeling of truth. As great poet Lermontov says, there is a sense in the heart of a man. Do you know this poem? And in some lecture about truth, here I said that people have truth, understanding of truth. Any person has an idea and the feeling of truth, especially a Soviet or Russian person who is literate and has gone through this, so to speak, diverse education. But in essence, it means that it is universal. We're talking about the universal spirit in opposition to matter. Let's say spirit is, as we know, a property of highly organized matter, which means it reflects the objective natural world. And highly organized, this is the social fabric of society. And he has the ability of reflection, the ability of the spirit. But this ability still needs to be developed. It's one thing if it's there somewhere at the early stages, but another thing is that it is not developed. When is it developed? When does it become developed? It becomes developed when the spirit begins to explore as an object, explore, recognize, explore as a subject, the highest universal principle. And this immediately inspired me to look for these roots in religion. Let's look for these roots in religion. Of course, in Hegel. It is somehow not customary for us to study Hegel seriously. I'm a specialist in the history of philosophy, and I study it. For us, it means that the science of logic is important, everything else is unimportant. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. At least Hegel has this brilliant philosophy of religion, where he examines all these questions and treats them all so seriously that everything that is common begins there to be comprehended and transmitted. Therefore, Apostle John says we must worship in spirit. God is spirit. You remember that? And we must worship in spirit and truth. And truth is therefore is the search. The search for the truth is the spirit. The spirit pursues the truth, devotes itself to the truth. And therefore, it was Spinoza who first expressed a more or less religious, but rather philosophical view on this matter. And he says that Spinoza, that the highest knowledge, amor intellectualis, intellectual love to God. So God is truth, God is spirit, and God is love. Love as a desire, broad one, including for the desire for the truth. That's already said by Spinoza in the 15th century. Therefore, here's the spirit of truth. It constitutes the essence of matter. And let's... about Marxism, we understand that Marx's life was filled with the search for truth. This is the spirit in such a high, pure form. By the way, in the Gospels, when Jesus stands before Pilate, Pilate asks him exactly this question: what is truth? And Jesus says, I will teach you the truth, and the truth shall make you free. John explains this several times, that the spirit is the main thing, and the spirit of truth. So when this religious spirit ended, it all ended in a split, and so the information, the scientific spirit arises of truth. Scientific spirit of truth arises. That is science, it also follows the truth, it also pursues the truth. And this is the truth, and this is the spirit of truth. And this is exactly what Lenin preserved after Marx and Engels. This is exactly what Stalin preserved. And he says the spirit of Marxism has left social democracy. He means the expression of Apostle John, who says in one place, the spirit blows where it wishes. breathes where it wishes. It comes from nowhere and goes to nowhere. It walks, the spirit, and chooses, therefore, people to be in the spirit. And since Stalin, he studied at a theological seminary, he, of course, knew all these things well for some reason, of course, because he was an intelligent man, talented, capable. This means that the spirit breathes where it wants. And it left social democracy, the spirit. And our scoundrels, the Khrushchevites, it left them. The Khrushchevites, the spirit. And it remained on this narrow path along which you and I walk, and on which we have persistently gathered for so many years, discussed, talked. Why? Because we feel that truth is here. The spirit of truth is here. And it's not found anywhere else. The scientific truth. Look at the West, it's all debauchery. Sodom and Gomorrah, and spiritually too, right? And not just in one single city, but in the whole state. Sodom and Gomorrah. The Pope now sanctioned homosexual marriage. It's amazing that the Lord hasn't poured a ton of sulfur on him, boiling sulfur. Well, I think it will. It's time. Yes, but unfortunately, it's a very interesting topic. So I became interested, and I am now delving into religions and all these matters. It's very interesting that the spirit, we need to deal with it. We need to work on construction and take an active role. Dear comrades, Mikhail Vasilievich Popov, in what year did he publish the book about understanding history? He says there, and writes there about this, that the role of the superstructure is underestimated. And in one Moscow magazine I wrote a review on this book, and I emphasize this point, that the moment of reverse impact of the superstructure onto economy, it had not been developed in science, or has been developed very poorly. And I think that is, of course, a big topic for us, and I expect that we will still have our say in this regard. Thank you, Alexander Sergeyevich. So let's move on the performances. Viktor Arkadyevich Tulkin signed up right away. So Alexander Sergeyevich and I have known each other for a while. Probably we will soon be, it will be soon 40 years old. 40 years, right? Yes, for 40 years we know each other. Yeah, we met at the Higher School of Political Science. Alexander Sergeyevich taught us philosophy. So the group was mainly made up of factory guys, secretaries of party committees, and so on. And we have always been delighted by the imagery of Alexander Sergeyevich, dialectical philosophical thinking, his ability to sort of lead the crab behind a rock and then get it out of there and sort of dissect it, and together with us translate all this into such a practical language so that it would be clear to us, yes, what to do, where to move, that is, what is the right, what is the left, and so on. Therefore, I think that today's discussions, they are interesting, useful, yes, but require some, translation into such, working language of workers. We know this definition of Comrade Stalin, that Leninism is Marxism of the era of imperialism and proletarian revolutions. That is, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was able to apply Marx's teachings in new conditions, developing them, supplementing them, introducing things that some perceived as revisionism, for example, the teaching about the possibility of revolution in a single country, right? And this follows from the entire analysis of imperialism and the theory of imperialism, the unevenness of development, and so on. At the same time, he delved into technology. Yeah? That means he deciphered what a revolutionary situation is, objective, subjective conditions, created the doctrine of a party of the vanguard type, a new type of party, and so on. That is, in principle, we feel that in modern conditions, modern world, it means probably our ability to understand the situation and apply it to today's conditions in order to the goals of Marxism, the construction of a society of free development for all and free from exploitation of private property. So the question is whether it's possible or impossible. And that's what Lenin explained. And here we should probably immediately remember that with us a whole range of different authorities, theorists, teachings, parties, large and small, exist next to us, which in general interpret it in a way that is not entirely suitable for us. Well, let's take such a public favorite thing as Sergei Kurgin, favorite guy. Sergei Ivanovich Kurgin. Yes, an excellent speaker, yes, an imaginative guy, and generally a good, so to speak, analyst and the like, and all that. So he distinguished himself on television when he defended Lenin's name there, and it seems. But what was his main conclusion? If we take the residue, figuratively speaking, Lenin is a genius kind of person that the humanity sends only once every few millennia. But the whole point is that he inherited the unique conditions of this weak link immediately after the war, including the armed masses, including the weakened world imperialist system. And Lenin managed to take advantage of this situation. But history gives this unique chance once every 5,000 years. It is unlikely that such a thing will happen again, comrades. Therefore, unfortunately, there is no point for us to follow Vladimir Ilyich example and move along the same path. We won't succeed here. We will have to create our own way, and the essence of the times will continue, and there will be rehash of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation and all sorts of other things. Here is one example, so to speak. Second example. So I had the chance, as I already mentioned, to talk with to Chavez. And Chavez at that time created the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, and so he gathered all the left forces there, including he was making great efforts to ensure that the communists also joined this party. And so I asked him, and it was in the State Duma, I was a deputy, and there was an opportunity to ask a few questions, so to speak, and I was lucky that my question was asked, conveyed to him, and I said, listen, we know that you're creating a party, and you want to create, well, the largest party, and relying on a party is, of course, a correct policy, and if that's how it turned out for you. But that's not enough. We know of large parties that were larger than those being created of yours, with a glorious history, yes, with victories behind them, and so on, and so forth. But the mistakes it made led it, you know, to a temporary but defeat. What are you laying down the program content in the program of your party, so that you, besides the Cubans, you know this, and so forth, and so forth. And his answer was that although you said that besides the Cubans, but I understand your question, so I will start with the Cubans. Fidel Castro, once journalists asked him, have you made mistakes in your revolutionary activities? And if you did, then which ones? To which Fidel replied, of course I did made mistakes, of course. And my biggest mistake was that at the beginning of my revolution activity, I thought that someone knew exactly how to build socialism. Right? There is no such single recipe or prescribed technology according to which we, like on the factory, we just lay out the drawings and moved on. So Chavez continues, Marx has developed the theory of socialism up to the end of the 19th century. Lenin for the 20th century, in the conditions that, so to speak, existed, and he analyzed imperialism. And today, us, we're developing our own theory, socialism of the 21st century, which, well, the link between scientific communism with Christianity, they have it there, and the construction of socialism of the 21st century. In fact, it means in the conditions of capitalism, as it was in Venezuela, but despite the fact that we managed to seize power and he was the president in this matter. Despite all that, all this ended, well, now we are observing, most likely history will again prove that this is impossible, because, let's return again to Leninism, because there are basic patterns. So Leninism, by and large, is the ability to apply the maps of Marxism to the road, to determine one's point of observation here and to determine the direction of movement, while maintaining the basic fundamental principles that are known, which are the dictatorship of the proletariat, the destruction of private property, and accordingly exploitation based on it. So it means free development of people, and so on. And here, to help Alexander Sergeyevich a little, I would like to materialize this concept of the spirit of Marxism and Leninism. The spirit of Marxism is the spirit of revolution, the revolutionary spirit. This is where the essence comes in. Vladimir Ilyich, by the way, described this matter quite well in Introduction to the Work of the State and the Revolution. Remember, here is his introduction, the very beginning. There are 2 or 3 paragraphs long. He says, the ruling classes, after the death of the great revolutionaries, right, who during their lifetime mercilessly persecuted the revolutionaries, oppressed, crushed, destroyed them in every way. But after their death, this often happens, provide a certain glory to their name. They stop oppressing them and try to take from their teaching what is acceptable to them. So what is not dangerous, what is suitable, what can be adapted, leaving the oppressed class as a consolation of some gilded icon, so to speak, emasculating, castrating the teaching, removing the revolutionary spirit from it. This is what he was talking about. So here, verbatim, I even looked. They forget, erase, distort the revolutionary side of the teaching, its revolutionary soul. And at the same time, Lenin set the task that says that our task consists, first of all, of restoring true teachings of Marx. So this can be related to today. You and me were in conditions of the strongest reaction on the global scale of this reaction. We got collapse of the camp of socialism and the strongest right-wing deviation in the left movement. First of all, here in Russia, when the leader of the #1 party receives the title of capitalist labor, when people's power is parliamentarism, and even we hear such terminology as they say that our task is the struggle for a parliamentary republic of the Soviet type. That's what CPRF proclaims. By the way, in 2005, or when Soviets celebrated the 100 years of Soviets, when the construction of socialism is considered possible on the basis of today's multi-structured economy through some kind of people's enterprises and other such bells and whistles and crap and so on. And in these conditions, our task is to preserve the spirit of Marxism, that is Leninism, its revolutionary soul, which means for the future of our movement, for the future of our movement, which is what we are doing, and we wish you success in this movement. Thank you. Victor Arkadyevich. Yes, I also said that the revolutionary side of Marxism was preserved by Leninism, and us, in fact, we preserve this revolutionary side. Scientific socialism together with this revolutionary social movement, along with. We are dealing with it. But I say, these questions, again I say that these questions, Engels remembered them too late. He died in the 95, he was 75 years old. About 70 years he remembered that they had done little of this work. This means that Stalin also draws attention to the fact that consciousness and attitude are of great importance, and it is clear that they develop the settings in these directions, but apparently not enough. And Stalin also pays attention to this. And the drama of our society is not only because now there is a Marxist worldview where spirit is reflected in a more or less complete volume, but this needs to be studied, to give it subjective form, mine, and not the one that is written in the book. This is a worldview that is written. It only helps to develop my spirit, my individual worldview. So I think that this topic is also important. We still support it, and I think that we will figure it out, find out, and work more efficiently in our ideological sphere. Thank you. Thank you, Alexander Sergeyevich. Announcement. So the topic of the next lesson is Marxism and religion. Viktor Arkadyevich Chulkin is the lecturer. Goodbye. Bye-bye.